Hi, I'm Brad Massey with the Tampa Bay History Center, and unfortunately, you cannot be here today to see our very awesome exhibit. But what we're going to do while we're all at home thinking about the coronavirus is we're going to give you a preview of Sunshine State Showdown, professional wrestling in Tampa. And you can take it from me, because I wrote it, it's pretty awesome. So the first thing we wanted to show you is we actually built a ring for this exhibit, and these ropes and turnbuckles actually came from an organization that was very kind enough to partner with us in this exhibit, and that is the WWE. Their archivist Ben Brown came and helped us out, and he loaned us a bunch of stuff, including these ropes and these turnbuckles, which are officially WWE equipment. And most important, this official wrestling bell. Let's get this tour started. All right, so needless to say, we here at the History Center think a lot about the past. I actually get paid to think about the past pretty much exclusively. So what we wanted to do is start off by talking about wrestling's ancient roots. Wrestling is really in humans' DNA, and wrestling goes all the way back to the ancient Greeks, the ancient Romans, and even the Mongolians. There was a famous Mongolian princess that said she would only marry a suitor that could defeat her in the square circle. They all failed. But later on, some Americans that you probably know were very involved in wrestling. George Washington was a local wrestling champion in Virginia, and Abraham Lincoln was a wrestling champion and a master of the side hold technique. So what we see is in early American history, and then later on, we have a long wrestling tradition. And one more thing I'll show you before we move on is check out this man right here. This is John McMahon, who used to battle people in the late 1800s, and I just wanted to show you his picture because his suspenders are awesome. All right, let's go this way. So one thing we wanted to do in this exhibit is we want to tell the story of wrestling, but we also wanted to talk a little bit about the material culture, but also the trash talk. So what you'll see as we do a tour of the exhibit is we have a lot of wrestling jargon and vocabulary that's up on the wall, and occasionally we have signature phrases like, "What you gonna do, brother?" from Hulk Hogan in 1990. So what we wanted to do was marry wrestling material things with wrestling trash talk and jargon. But let's walk over here, Manny. Let me talk a little bit about new techniques, big payouts, and worked matches. So what happened is in America in the late 1800s and 1900s is promoters found out people don't want to watch wrestlers grapple for hours on end. What they want to see is awesome moves. They want to see suplexes. They want to see body slams. And they want to see them in short bursts. So you had promoters like Jack Curley, the Gold Dust Trio, that decided what we should do for audiences is we should script these matches, we should give them time limits, and we should provide them entertainment in short bursts. Of course, one of the ironies is as the matches become more scripted, more people start to watch them, and they realize that it was marketing gold. Which brings us to another important evolution in wrestling's history, and that is the television, which we call watching the hammer drop on TV. Wrestling and television, my friends, go together like peas and carrots, because early on, we didn't have the camera angles that we have today. You know, you watch an NFL game, you see a camera that's suspended on top of the field. They didn't have that. What they did is they take a camera and they put it right on the ring, and they said, oh, this is the perfect sports extravaganza for us to put on TV. So in no time at all the major networks had television wrestling matches or televised wrestling matches. And what you saw is this really democratized the American wrestling audience. All of a sudden, there were more women at wrestling matches than men by the 1950s, and television took wrestling nationwide. Which brings us to the era of Tampa and the Fort Homer Hester Lee Armory. So what happens is, after World War II, you have the territorial period in wrestling in 1950s, 1960s, 1970s, and shortly thereafter, where wrestlers will travel from territory to territory. And one of our most popular wrestlers here in Tampa during this period was this man right here, the American Dream, Dusty Rhodes. Look how happy he is. Dusty was great. He traveled the circuit. He won a bunch of titles, and most importantly, for those of y'all that are Tampa people, he actually lived here in Tampa. So Dusty Rhodes becomes this really important link between the wrestling scene and the city of Tampa. And the other important link, if we can go over here, Manny, is where these bouts went down. So for some of you that are maybe older than you'd like to admit, and you remember wrestling in the distant past in the 1960s and 1970s, you might remember bouts at the Armory. The Fort Homer Hester Lee Armory here in Tampa was the showcase for wrestlers. People like Dusty Rhodes, the Briscoe Brothers, they would come to the Hester Lee Armory and they would battle in front of audiences of thousands. And it was also at the Armory that Championship Wrestling from Florida would film bouts for TV, or film wrestling bouts, I should say, for TV. So the Hester Lee Armory was incredibly important. And now I want to show you one of our favorite things that we currently have on display in this exhibit. And this is something that when the History Center opens back up, you need to come and check out for yourself. And this is it. We actually have a championship belt from the NWA, which was the National Wrestling Alliance, period. And this was loaned to us by our friends at the WWE, in particular Ben Brown. And as you can see, this belt was held by Jack Briscoe, Terry Funk, Harley Race, Dusty Rhodes, and a host of others. But I'm going to share an interesting tidbit about this belt with you. If you look really close, and Manny's going to try to zoom in, you'll see some initials. They say KVE. There was a person known as Kerry Von Erich who held this belt for a very short period of time. He was a transitional champion, and what he did was he engraved his initials himself into the belt. Now that's dedication to the squared circle. Now, I had talked a little bit about some of the wrestling jargon and great things like that we have on the wall. What we also wanted to do in this exhibit is to have an interactive to get you thinking about wrestling vocabulary and to use a wrestling term to get you smart on the business. So what we have down here, when you're able to come in, is we have an interactive where you match the wrestling word, in this instance, kayfabe, with the definition. And kayfabe was incredibly important. What happened was, before the 1990s, wrestlers would always try to keep kayfabe. In other words, they wouldn't let onto the audience that wrestling is choreographed, that it's scripted, and that the matches are worked. So what you have is kayfabe was very important in the industry until the 1990s. So we can get you smart on these words. We'll get you smart on kayfabe. We'll get you smart on Barry. We'll get you smart on heel, smart on heat, all these different words that are incredibly important in wrestling history. All right. And then, of course, wrestling at the end of the day is about personas. There's no hometown wrestlers. Sure, Dusty Rhodes is a Tampa guy, but you don't think of him as being Tampa's wrestler. So personalities become incredibly important. So what you'll see in our exhibit is we've profiled a series of wrestlers that have ties to the Tampa Bay area, and some of them have ties to Florida. And one of the first ones that we profile here is Judy the Barefoot Contessa Grable. And she was one of my favorites when I was writing this exhibit, because she literally links circus culture with wrestling. She spent some time in Sarasota, and she actually worked for the Ringling Brothers Circus. So circuses used to show early worked matches. Judy worked for the circus, so she's a great link between the circus period and what becomes professional wrestling after World War II. And then another important figure, sadly someone who died here in Tampa recently, he died in Lutz, is Rocky the Soul Man Johnson. Rocky the Soul Man was incredibly important. He used to travel the circuit, and he traveled in at difficult times, the 1960s, 1970s, near the end of the Jim Crow era. So he's going to have to fight some of the racism and some of the other things that came up in American culture at the time, but he's incredibly important. So not only do we profile him, but we actually have one of his wrestling ensembles on display, which we're going to show y'all in a couple minutes. But let's come over this way, because I want to show you just a couple more people that we have previewed here. One of my favorites, just because this is the era that I watched wrestling in, was Brutus the Barber Beefcake. So some of you might remember his shears. Some of you might remember him cutting Jimmy the Mouth of the South Heart's hair during one of the WrestleManias. But what you might not know is the Barber is a local Tampa guy, and he trained with Hulk Hogan. So he's really important. And like these others, he illustrates that link between Tampa wrestlers and broader wrestling, especially in the 1980s and 1990s. And what we have here on display, as Manny just showed you, these are some of his clippers. And actually in this wrestling program, he's holding these exact clippers. And this was something that our friends at the WWE agreed to loan us. And one thing I just wanted to tell y'all real quick is when you come and see our exhibit, what you'll find is most of these, actually not most of them, all of these wrestlers are to scale. So you see Brutus the Barber here is about 6'4". That's about my height. You can see we're about the same. And one thing we wanted to do for y'all is give you an idea of the size of these people, because as you well know, a lot of them are huge. So, Manny, let's walk over this way. I'm going to show y'all some other stuff that we have on display here. You'll see us walk past some other wrestlers that you can learn about. We have Chyna, who went to the University of Tampa. We have The Rock, who, of course, played football at the University of Miami. We have Natalya, who lives here in Tampa and who actually is a current wrestler. She's still stepping inside the squared circle. And one thing we wanted to do, I was telling you earlier about the Soul Man's robes. Wrestling personas rely so heavily on clothing and costumes, so we wanted to put a few of these things on display. And Rocky was so important that we got his robe, his ensemble, and we put it on display. And one interesting thing about this is this robe was actually handmade by Rocky Johnson's wife. And there's a tag on the inside that reads, "Made especially for you by your loving wife." So, really cool handcraft thing. The other one, as Manny pans over right now, he's showing you Rocky Johnson's boots. What we also have is the robe of Harley Race. And Harley Race was a big deal during the territorial period. He actually at one time held that belt that we have on display. And this is the robe that he wore. And he was dubbed, I should say he dubbed himself, the greatest wrestler on God's green earth. So some of y'all are sending in some messages, and my colleague Rodney is going to read them out. What you can do during this tour if you want and afterwards is you can send me your trash talk, which we'll talk about in a second. You can also send me your questions. So what's the question, Rodney?
We got a couple questions. One is, who is Dr. Brad's favorite wrestling personality?
Ooh, one question was, who is Dr. Brad's favorite wrestling personality? The answer to that question is the Macho Man Randy Savage. I actually have a t-shirt. I was going to wear it, but they told me I need to wear something with a collar for this tour. But the Macho Man Randy Savage is my favorite. He's actually profiled here. He's on one of our banners. So when you come to the exhibit, you can come check out the Macho Man. And right behind Manny, he's going to pan up for you really slow. One thing I wanted was one of the Macho Man's famous quotes from a promo video. And he talked about how he was the cream because he was the top wrestler. And you'll see that we have here on the wall, "The cream will rise to the top. Oh, yeah," which the Macho Man said in 1987. Thank you, Rodney.
One more question. Ivan Santos from Puerto Rico. So we've got people in Puerto Rico watching this. Is this a permanent museum was the question, but I think what he asked is this a permanent exhibit?
So Rodney said the question is this a permanent exhibit? And the answer to that question is no. This is a temporary exhibit. As you know, things are up in the air right now with our scheduling, but currently this exhibit is scheduled to close in October. So as soon as things get better, you need to get yourself down here, you need to buy a ticket, and you need to check out these wrestlers before they're gone. So the plan right now is that this will be here until October. It may be extended, but we just don't know at this point.
One more question.
And we have one more question.
People want to, really a piece of Dr. Brad.
Yeah.
And so this is would be kind of close to your heart. Is it true that Dusty Rhodes lived in original Carrollwood?
Is it true that Dusty Rhodes lived in original Carrollwood? My neighbor told me for a fact that Dusty Rhodes used to live in original Carrollwood. I'm not going to tell you what his name is, but according to my neighbor, the answer to that question is yes, absolutely. All right, so I Want to tour you here to the back of the exhibit and show you a few more things. So there's a couple other people, or actually a few other people, that are really important in Tampa history, wrestling history, and we try to profile them here. One of the major wrestling families in the area were the Grahams, and you had Eddie and Mike Graham. And Eddie was the manager of Championship Wrestling from Florida for a long time, and he's an incredibly important promoter in the state. And then his son, Mike, was a wrestler as well, so we have them profiled in our case. We also have a wrestler who retired in Tampa known as Bearcat Wright. He was a master of the claw hold, and he was also a title-winning wrestler that traveled the circuit. I had the pleasure of meeting the Wright family, and Paul Wright's son was nice enough to give us this photo to put on display. He also wanted us to tell y'all that Bearcat Wright was also a talented musician and a pilot. So really interesting guy in the history of professional wrestling. And then there's one other really important thing when it comes to wrestling in Tampa. Wrestling, or I should say training for wrestling, has been incredibly important here in Tampa, really since World War II. And we have a man profiled right here with this title that says a man of a few words, and that's Hiro Matsuda. And Matsuda was a really famous wrestling trainer. He trained, among others, Hulk Hogan, and there's an interesting story behind that. On Hulk Hogan's first day of training, Matsuda broke his leg. It's believed to be intentionally. But Hulk Hogan was not deterred. He came back, and Matsuda trained him, and then, of course, the Hulkster went on to become the Hulkster. And, yes, we didn't look at his banner, but he is definitely profiled here in this exhibit. And a couple other things that we wanted to show you is the other picture in the case was of the Briscoe Brothers, who are incredibly important, and they're profiled here in the exhibit. But then another thing that wrestlers have become famous for, people like John Cena, Hulk Hogan, The Rock, is they do a crossover to Hollywood. So we talk a little bit about going Hollywood, getting on the silver screen, and also doing some small screen work. One of my favorite pictures that we have here in the exhibit is Hulk Hogan throwing a villain from the A-Team. For those of you that remember the 80s as well as I do, you'll remember the A-Team was a big deal, and the Hulkster made a guest appearance. So if you come down and see the exhibit, you can learn all about how these wrestlers are going to cross over into Hollywood, and a lot of them are going to have very successful careers. Couple other things, wrestling is all about trash talk. And one of our favorite things we did in this exhibit is we said, hey, this is what we should do. When people come, let's tell them that they should trash talk us on the way out. So we wrote on this title panel, feeling cheated, write down your feedback and we will ignore it. And what we told patrons is write down what you're thinking on these pencils and this paper. Throw it in this trash can, and then we will read it and make fun of you at our collections department meeting. So unfortunately, you can't come down here right now to trash talk us. You can do it on Facebook Live if you like, though. But as soon as the museum is back open, we welcome y'all to all come in, take a look at the exhibit, and shoot us some trash talk on the way out the door. Now, my colleague Rodney told me that we have one more question, so I'm happy to answer this question really quick. Yes? Is WrestleMania happening in Tampa? Unfortunately, the answer is no. WrestleMania will not be happening in Tampa. My understanding is the latest update was they moved it to Orlando, and they're going to be holding the bouts in a closed facility. So unfortunately, there won't be any fans there, but they will still be having matches.
And the questions keep coming in.
Yeah, one more question.
All right, so what does WWE stand for, and was there other name, and why did they change it?
Yeah, so that's a really interesting story. It used to be the World Wrestling Federation, but the problem is there's another WWF. It's the World Wildlife Federation. And so there was basically a legal tangle, if you'll let me use a wrestling term, between the WWF, the wrestling organization, and the World Wildlife Federation. So then what the Wrestling Federation is going to do is they're going to change their name to the WWE.
And now I think it's kind of trivia time.
I'm only taking one more, Rodney.
WrestleMania 33. Who has Nikki Bella as a
Oh, that's a good question to end with because I do not know the answer. That's outside of my wrestling purview. So I do not know the answer to that question.
Well, there you go.
But here's what we'll do. If y'all want to keep sending us in questions, we're going to turn off the cameras, but we will read through them. And if we choose to respond to you, we will. If you're a measly ham and egger that has a lousy question, we'll just talk about you behind your back. But in all seriousness, we appreciate you tuning in today. Please send us your questions and your trash talk, and we'll shout out right back at you. Thank you very much.